What's a fact or saying that gets repeated constantly on Reddit that just isn't true? Many people on Reddit are 100% certain that opossums eat thousands of ticks per night. They just don't. And you will be downvoted to oblivion for pointing it out most of the time. Ticks are tiny, and it would take an opossum days to eat enough for a full meal. Do they eat ticks sometimes? Sure, but the ticks they eat are mostly removed during their own grooming, and they would much rather be eating a rotten animal corpse on the side of the road, or breaking into the farmer's coop to kill and eat their chickens' eggs. They will eat anything that they can to survive and reproduce. The grass is greener where you water it. No. It often isn't. And that's the entire point of the original quote about the other side. People need to understand that no matter how much you water, invest in, work on, cultivate, etc. a certain situation, other situations will still sometimes look more appealing for reasons of superficiality or, especially, novelty. The proverbial grass won't always be greener where you water it, and it pays to look for longer-term appeal than the seasonal greenness of your grass. That school districts in the US are mostly funded by local property taxes, resulting in schools in richer areas being better funded. In every state but Illinois, this is untrue. Most states fund schools with a combination of state income taxes and local property taxes. Districts that don't have as much property taxes get more state funds. Also, federal government funds make up 8-10 of school funding and are targeted to poor districts, so schools in poor areas actually get more funding than those in richer areas. Given my conversations today, that suddenly in the 1960s all the Dixiecrats jumped to being Republicans, and the GOP took over the South. The fact is the GOP didn't gain both houses of any Deep South legislatures to ban from Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana and Arkansas until after 2000. Had the Dixiecrats left in the 1960s as it is mythologized, the legislative changes would have happened, and instead of 50 years they all died. That lobster was such a poor man's food that it was served to prisoners, ground up, shell and all. Absolute nonsense. While lobster used to be cheaper when it was abundant and not overfished like today, it was never so cheap it was ever regularly served to prisoners, let alone so much they protested against it. And grinding up a lobster shell is a great way to ruin a lobster. Why bother serving it to prisoners at all if it's going to be inedible? That facts don't care about your feelings. Emotions are what drives us to pursue goals like space exploration and all the sciences. Our passions and likewise our success is built upon our emotions. No matter how flawed, emotions can and have gotten in the way of progress. So I'm not saying constantly rely on your emotions for answers, but it's alright to have an opinion based solely on how you feel. Also, if you're reading this, have a good day. Not Reddit specific, but you do see it a lot. People saying they do something pleasurable to get their dopamine hit. Dopamine in that context is linked to motivation and anticipation rather than pleasure. If it's an enjoyable thing you expect, dopamine activity will be rising as you do the task which achieves the reward, and will already be falling when you get the reward. And the pleasurable feeling itself isn't directly related to dopamine. Einstein said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, and expecting different results. Point 1. There's no evidence he ever said that. 2. That saying doesn't even make sense. When would the definition of anything be a single example? Are insane people known for acting in a repeated manner? 3. Things done the same way often have different results for any number of reasons. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and expecting different results. Definition of insanity. You could say it's insane to keep on doing the same thing and expecting it to suddenly work, but the way people recite the quote is like a mic drop. Conversation enders. Dare I say, insane. HR is there to protect the company, not you. Yeah, but the Venn diagram of things that protect you, the worker, and things that protect the company is nearly a circle. Like, yeah, HR wants to protect the company from dealing with labor law violations and slam dunk civil suits. Most of the people who trot this out are basically cunts blaming HR for their own actions. Not just Reddit, but the idea that the Library of Alexandria was burned down and its books were lost. While there were indeed some fires at the library, They were all localized, and there is no evidence that one conflagration destroyed the entire thing. Rather, as Alexandria's importance declined, so did the libraries, and repeated battles destroy more of it than fires did. Just head over to any DJT sub or Republican sub. You'll find thousands, edit or look, a bunch of whiny-ass Republicans who got hurt over the truth. Talk about brainwash, and like I would ever give a flying fuck what a bunch of far-right dillhole think, especially dillholes who are fine with a lying, narcissistic, racist felon, God help you all. That Middle Eastern countries like Jordan have banned Palestinians because Palestinians are subhuman filth. Millions of Palestinians live in Jordan and elsewhere in the Middle East besides the Palestinian territories. The whole premise is flawed. But if ignorant bigots knew how to do basic research, they wouldn't be ignorant bigots. It has become a trend for women to say that their belly will never be flat because of their uterus. A non-pregnant uterus is smaller than a fist and sits behind the bladder. It's normal for women of all sizes to have low belly fat that prevents a flat stomach, but it's certainly not because the uterus is protruding out. Most things people say about how religion was supposedly inherently against reasonable inquiry, science, ority of human history. It wasn't possible to exclusively define or practice either of them. They were naturally linked, and separating them into two opposing social categories is rather more strange. I see people say low-fat stuff just has more sugar all the time, and lately I've started checking labels on low-fat stuff, and it just doesn't seem to be true for most things. I remember seeing a comment from someone on Reddit where they said this was more of a thing back in the 90s, hence why people believe it. There are no benefits to male circumcision. Yes, there are. Chances of phimosis, smegma, STs, penile cancer are all greatly reduced. An Oxford study suggests less chance of HIV too. Puritanism died out before America was even a country. People got sick of it. It's not the reason for much of anything at this point except maybe an increased focus on education in the Northeast, Victorian culture, Southern religious revivals, and the Red Scare are much bigger conservative influences today. That there's no such thing as bad publicity. Known for something bad is better than not being known at all. But if this statement were always true, then corporations wouldn't have PR departments and they'd be saying wild shit every day on purpose. Nutritionist and dietitian are typically interchangeable on the state level and require the same amount of education, training, and certification to practice. Reddit seems to think that because one of these terms isn't federally regulated, anyone can claim the title and open a clinic. This is a mental health issue. I can't stand that shit. And Reddit are qualified to make that judgment in a professional setting. But none of us, including the professionals, are qualified to make that judgment from a 30-second TikTok video without context. Taxing corporations is a great way to reduce their profit. Every corporate tax is paid by people, most often consumers, sometimes employees, and rarely owners. Corporate taxes are hidden tax that politicians assume people are too ignorant to figure out. They seem to be right. That corporations are buying up all single-family homes in the US. This has happened in a few markets, but is not nearly as widespread as Reddit makes it out to be. 1/5 of all single-family homes are corporately owned, but the vast majority of those are family LLCs. Well, if it's on Reddit, but people think carrots make your eyesight better. I used to reply to those people telling them it isn't true. That was a thing made up during WWI, and they replied to me saying things like, "But it does make my eyesight better." People often say you need to pull yourself up by yourself bootstraps in order to express that you need to work harder. The saying actually originated to describe things that were impossible, like being able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. People on Reddit, the internet in general, always say Japan has a high suicide rate compared to the US. This was true in the early 2000s. But not anymore. Somewhat surprising considering how poorly their economy is doing in contrast to the US's. People misusing cognitive dissonance constantly. No, it doesn't mean being a hypocrite or having to contradicting ideas, thoughts. It specifically means the discomfort that comes from trying to reconcile those incompatible thoughts. nearly any opinions atheists has against religion. Why do I say this? Because they're always conflicting the acts of extremists to the actual teachings. So it's like, do you even know what you're actually talking about? The BS that women supposedly all want a man who's 6 feet or taller. Is this something specific within the African American community? Because I can't think of any other community where a 6 feet man is even common, except maybe Norway. The idea that people aren't having more kids because it's too expensive, they can't afford it. Literally all the evidence says otherwise. The people who have the most children are the ones in developing countries who are very poor. When freedom of speech is discussed and that XKCD comic gets banned, to one about it only protecting you from arrest by the government. That's the US Constitution's version of freedom of speech. But it's not the definition. Jack Gleason Joffrey from Game of Thrones got so much hate for his role that he quit acting. The truth is he quit for his own personal reasons, and has gone on record saying he's only ever met nice people in regards to fans. That all the boomers were able to buy houses on single incomes as a milk delivery man. Actually, the rates of home ownership are currently higher than they ever were in the 70s, 80s, and almost all of the 90s. That retailers won't bust a shoplifting suspect until they reach a felony amount. I worked in retail loss prevention for 10 years, and this is so far from the truth. I literally lol every time I see it on here. When people believe that any time someone is involved in a difficult situation with a large corporation and they killed themselves, it was a hit and not suicide. Reflexively smooth brain take.